Okay, you're up.
Okay, cool. So again, the title of this book in its entirety is At the End of the Dark Street, Black Women, Rape, and Resistance, A New History of the Civil Rights Movement from Rosa Parks to the Rise of Black Power by Danielle McGuire, who is a female historian. Um, this book has two primary points that include acknowledging the way sexual violence and sexuality are used to maintain white supremacy, primarily historically, but you can make connections to contemporary America. And it also touches upon reframing the traditional narrative of the civil rights movement, which is very male-centric. So the book starts off by going into Rosa Parks' background, and it cites some pretty important information given to her by her grandfather about mistrusting white men, which really informed how she would go about the rest of her life, and she'd recall back to her grandfather's experiences of guarding their porch with a gun all night long to protect their family. Um, so Rosa Parks' actual introduction to activist work was when Reese Taylor, who was a young African American mother, was gang raped, and the suspects were clear. They were identified. The car was identified, but the assailants, all six of them, were not prosecuted. So then what Rosa Parks did was she went around primarily the southern United States to chronicle experiences of women, particularly black women, who had faced sexual violence. Going forward, it addresses both the Montgomery bus strikes and desegregation. So I'll talk a little bit about the Montgomery events first. So before Rosa Parks, there was Claudette Colvin, who was a teenager who was removed from the Montgomery bus prior to Rosa Parks. And they considered actually having Claudette Colvin be the leader of the movement with the bus strikes. However, Claudette was from a low-income area and found herself pregnant. And so they were very worried that like class divisions within the movement and like moral divisions could jeopardize like the movement as a whole. So they go on. Rosa Parks does a ton of work with Joanne Robinson and the Women's Political Council prior to the founding of the Montgomery Improvement Association. E.D. Nixon was super involved in a ton of activist work in the area, and he was like a very prominent organizer. But actually, in the initial Montgomery Improvement Association meeting, which would be the organization to spearhead the bus boycotts, both Rosa Parks and Joanne Robinson were excluded from those meetings when they decided the leadership. And they would elect to have Martin Luther King become their base of the organization. And at the time, he was very young and unestablished. So the women of the WPC, however, were like board members and really the head organizers of the MIA. They made great contributions to the bus strikes. They were the primary facilitators of carpools. They were the largest demographic of protesters due to their high presence in domestic roles as working in homes, and women raised money by selling food to support them in their communities. So throughout this narrative, however, it's riddled by instances of women who are raped by white men, oftentimes police officers, who are acquitted. Often they were instances of gang rape. So I will disclose, yeah, if you read this book, it is pretty graphic and really upsetting because it is instance after instance after instance, which has a great weight, and there's great explanation for that in terms of like how prominent it was and how impactful it is when you recognize it, but it was unrecognized primarily. However, there was a double standard where if a white woman accused an African American of rape, they were sentenced severely, often to death. Um, and however, in 1959, Betty Jean Owen, who was a Texas A&M student, was raped by 4 white men, and they were the first white men to be prosecuted for sexual violence against a woman of color. However, they got 20 years of hard labor rather than life in jail or a death sentence that was faced by men of color. And again, men of color were often falsely accused of rape and killed for it. Moving on to desegregation and the implications of sexuality there, there was this whole ideology that was pushed by the White Christian Citizens Council, which a lot of local politicians held leadership in and worked with the city. They promoted the ideology that desegregation equaled black savagery, or that term black savagery, which was just major fear-mongering that people who supported desegregation just wanted interracial marriage and interracial sexual happenings. And again, it shows the implications, the double standard for men and women in the Black community of how sexuality was either used to suppress them or both ways, used to suppress them. So then it moves on to talk a lot about Fannie Lou Hamer's story. If you're not familiar with Fannie Lou Hamer, she was a really incredible organizer who organized throughout the South, and she was sterilized without her consent. And this primarily talked about, and she did incredible work with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee as her primary charge, but she also, when she was arrested, she faced extreme violence, and she went on to talk about this and testify about this, but also included a lot of the violence that was used against her was sexualized, which was also a very prominent thing that was happening in the South at this time. It's really interesting connecting the historical trauma to trauma today when American Indians are twice as likely to experience a rape or sexual assault compared to any other race, and if you look at how they are suppressed in a contemporary setting, it's evident that sexuality has been an avenue of maintaining white supremacy throughout history. Any questions?
Well, what were strengths and weaknesses of the book?
Sure. It was it was incredible. It's hard to criticize this book. It was super strong in terms of content and acknowledging that even talking from Montgomery bus strikes to desegregation, that within all of those, they use sexual violence as a way to connect those. It is a hard read because a book of this size, it took me double the amount of time to read what it traditionally takes me to read a book of this size, just because it is very, very content heavy. And it's also really tolling the explanation of instances of sexual violence. They don't really shy away from labeling all sexual violence as sexual violence. They explain a lot of gang rape. They explain a lot of molestation, etc. So that was, I guess, pretty hard. But overall, I thought it was one of the coolest books I've ever read.
Say more why that was one of the coolest books you ever read.
Sure. I think that we talked about it last semester in Tobin's class, about the traditional narrative of the civil rights movement, and I always am oh, but Fannie Lou Hamer, but she's sort of tokenized of being that woman of the civil rights movement, and so is Rosa Parks, but really understanding Rosa Parks' background and noting that learning more about all of those people, not just tokenizing them, was super cool to get that background. And it was also just really interesting to hear that narrative of the civil rights movement in a way that is more intersectional and really acknowledges women's contribution to the civil rights movement and the injustices done to those women within their own movement. Sure.
What was something you learned that surprised you?
Just the level of like severity of sexual assault that was ongoing. I did not realize that gang rape was so prominent, but if you do choose to read this book, it's instance after instance after instance.
Any last words?
You should read it.
It's a very important work historiographically, as Megan and I were talking about at the beginning of class, because as she noted, the prevalence of sexual violence was simply not well documented or understood by historians of the civil rights movement. And this opens up this whole new pathway of inquiry and